Hello. Now we're going to look at life at the turn of the 20th century. Our learning objectives are to explain how immigration to the United States changed between 1880 and 1910 and to describe the lives of most immigrants. In the early 1800s, many immigrants came to America from Northern and Western Europe. Between 1880 and 1910, a new wave of immigration took place. Immigrants from Europe arrived at Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Most of them came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigrants often lived in crowded tenement buildings, like this one, shown on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Sanitation was a major problem in these buildings. Immigrants often worked in low-paying jobs, working long hours and in dangerous conditions. Many immigrants also faced prejudice and discrimination. Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in 1889, and others started settlement houses to help immigrants adjust and to overcome poverty. Our next learning objective is to describe the political scandals and the reform efforts of the Gilded Age. By the late 1800s, many American cities had problems such as crime, bad housing, and poor sanitation. In some cities, control of local government passed to a political machine which was an organization of professional politicians. They made cities run better, but they often were corrupt. The most notorious political machine was Tammany Hall in New York City. William Marcy Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, was the boss of Tammany Hall. The former congressman used his power to make himself and his friends wealthy. His power appeared unbreakable until 1871, when his corruption was made public. He was convicted of fraud and was sent to prison. During the second term of Ulysses S. Grant, a scandal called the Credit Mobilier scandal broke. Money that was supposed to be going to set up the Union Pacific Railroad, but the Credit Mobilier Company was funneling money to shareholders, which included members of Congress and the Vice President. One successful reform was the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which ensured that civil service jobs would be awarded based on merit, not on political connections. The act was signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur, who became president after James Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. In the late 1800s, farmers faced numerous problems, from falling crop prices to rising costs. For example, the railroads were getting rich, but the farmers could not afford the high shipping rates. The National Grange of the Order of the Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grange for short, was started as a fraternal order for farmers. Membership exploded in the mid-1870s, and the organization became politically active. They pushed hard for government regulation of the railroads. And this brings us to another debate, the silver versus gold debate. Another group of farmers, the Farmers Alliance, thought that they could get more money for their crops if the money supply increased. In 1873, the dollar was placed on the gold standard, meaning that the U.S. dollars were redeemable from the U.S. Treasury for gold only. That limited the amount of money in circulation because you couldn't have any more money than you had gold to back. This group wanted our dollar to be based on silver, which would increase the money supply. Alliance members eventually formed the People's Party, more commonly known as the Populist Party. This political party pushed for bank regulation, government ownership of railroads, and the free coinage of silver. The Populist Party ran William Jennings Bryan for president in 1896 after his Cross of Gold speech won him popular support. The Populist Party ran William Jennings Bryan for president in 1896 after his Cross of Gold speech won him populist support. The Republican candidate was William McKinley, who received millions of dollars of support from business leaders. McKinley won the election of 1896. After Reconstruction ended, white Southerners sought to keep African Americans from voting. They used poll taxes, which are taxes that had to be paid to vote, and literacy tests to prevent blacks from voting. Most African Americans were too poor to pay the poll taxes and had been denied an education and thus were unable to pass the literacy tests. Of course, the literacy tests were often given in a manner that, to say the least, was not fair and was very arbitrary. For example, they might give a white voter something fairly simple to read, something that was easy, and hand a very complex legal document that would be difficult for anybody to understand to an African American. So these literacy tests were not what they appeared to be on the surface, and they were really used as a means to discriminate. Soon, Southern state legislatures passed Jim Crow laws, which created legal segregation in public places. Then, public segregation was challenged in the Supreme Court in a case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court upheld legal segregation by establishing a doctrine known as separate but equal. They ultimately said that you could have separate facilities for the races so long as they were equal. And this decision would stand for the next 58 years. It wasn't until the U.S. Civil Rights Movement got started in the 1950s that the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, came before the court, and the court decided there, kind of reversing position, that separate was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. But for 58 years, the Plessy decision allows legalized segregation to exist in the United States. The worst outcome of this discrimination that African Americans faced in this time period was lynching, or the hanging of individuals by a lynch mob. Between 1882 and 1892, nearly 900 African Americans lost their lives to lynch mobs. The lynching declined after 1892, but it did continue well into the 1900s. A couple of major African American leaders appear about this time frame as well. One was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois believed that African Americans should push for full equal rights immediately, while the other was Booker T. Washington, who believed that they had to accept segregation for the time being, but that African Americans could improve their situation through education. And he founded the Tuskegee Institute to educate African Americans. Mexican Americans often had to take menial jobs for low pay. Many were trapped in the system of debt peonage, meaning that they could not leave the jobs until they repaid their employers. Debt peonage was made illegal in 1911. Many Asian Americans, mostly Chinese and Japanese, faced discrimination in housing. And in California, they were not allowed to marry whites in the early 1900s. Native Americans faced discrimination too. They were pushed to become Americanized by the government, forced to live on reservations with little economic opportunity, and could not even become citizens until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924.